All right. So creating, today I'm going to be talking about creating layouts and landing pages in Drupal. And I'm really going to plunge into the layout builder versus paragraphs debate today. So that should be fun. I know that's a question at top of mind for a lot of people that I talk to. So hopefully this will be an interesting topic for all of you here today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Suzanne Dargacheva. I'm the co-founder of Evolving Web, a Drupal agency here in Montreal. I'm also on the board of the Drupal Association. I'm one of the community elected members. And I love talking about content strategy. I teach Drupal, and I love making it easier to use. So if you're interested in any of those things, please come talk to me. I'm Suzanne_Kennedy on Twitter. And I'm Pixelite on Drupal Slack and Drupal.org and everywhere. Okay, so the reason maybe you're here today is because you're into Drupal. You're maybe a site builder. You're a themer. You're a developer. That's who I tend to run into at DrupalCons. But the Drupal content editor experience is really important. And we heard this at the Dries note yesterday. You'll hear this more and more, I think, in the Drupal community, the importance of the content editor experience and making those types of users really happy, especially when they're just getting out started with using Drupal. And for content editors, you know, there's a lot of things we think of when we think of Drupal, but I think for content editors, it's this content creation experience that's really at the heart of what they think of when they think of Drupal. And so it's important to think about what content editors want. And I was actually involved over the last couple years in some UX research of Drupal and thinking about this question of what content editors want. And we actually went out and asked them. And it's not surprising to know that content editors want like an interface that's more designed for them to go and create content. And these days, what that content looks like has kind of changed. So in the past, when we thought about content, we often thought about these pages of content like, you know, a basic page, an article, an event. And nowadays, when we think of content, the types of pages that I think content editors are trying to create and trying to build look more like this. They look more like what I would call landing pages. They look more visual. They look more like magazine-style pages. And you're probably familiar with these, whatever your role is on a project. And if we're a themer or a site builder, you know, we could probably think of 5 or 10 ways in Drupal of building these types of pages. But as a content editor, it can be kind of intimidating, like, oh, I saw this other website. There's this page that I really want to build. It looks like this, and yet, like, how can I possibly do that in Drupal? So content editors want to be able to easily create pages on the fly that look really visual, that match the brand of the website, and that they can use to build out their content strategy. And often that means combining different types of content components on a single page. And it's really hard to plan in advance for all the future needs of pages like this. It's not like building an event content type where every field is predefined. And that makes this problem really difficult. So since the beginning of my time using Drupal, we've been kind of looking for the perfect solution of how to do this. I think my first ever talk at a Drupal event was about using panels. And since then, site designs have only gotten more varied and more visual and more complicated. And our expectations of what a content editor should be able to do has probably increased. So the first thing I want to do today, now that we've kind of talked about the problem I want to think about, is I want to differentiate between two really important things: page building and layout building. And of course, Drupal can do both these things because Drupal's amazing and can do all kinds of complex things. But these are kind of different tasks. And the reason that it's important to distinguish between them is that, you might pick different tools depending on what kind of task you're doing. And you might also expect content editors to be able to do page building, but not layout building. So when I say layout building, and maybe that's a term that I'm inventing, I don't know. When I think about layout building, I think of what you're doing more as a site builder or a themer. When you're deciding, okay, for every recipe on this website, as an example, this is how the fields are going to look. So I have a screenshot here with a pizza picture of a pizza on the left-hand side and all these other fields about this recipe on the right-hand side. And I would expect, every recipe on my website is probably going to look the same. I want to create this predictable interface. So this kind of page layout work, I think of as layout building. And this screenshot here is setting this up, doing the layout builder, but there are, of course, other ways to do that in Drupal as well. Then when I think about page building, I think about more of a content editor task, like a content editor comes along and they want to design the page the way they have the content kind of mapped out in their heads. So maybe they want to put a banner at the top of the page, and then they want to add some marketing messages, and maybe they decide that the call to action, the main call to action, goes at the very bottom of the page because the user has to consume all kinds of information first. And so their ability to create a page that's not just a standard set of fields, but a more visual page where the content editor is actually selecting not just the content and the fields that are input, but actually a little bit about the content structure itself. So that's what I think of as page building. It's a little bit more advanced than content editing, but it's not the same as layout building. So often when you're creating a Drupal site, you're creating probably a lot of structured content. Most Drupal sites we build are including a lot of content types that are all following the same template. But probably part of the site that you're building, if you have any kind of marketing requirements at all for the website, you're probably designing a page building tool. And I like thinking about this as building a tool and not building a set of pages or building a set of nice marketing landing pages. And so all the questions that are going to determine like what approach you take, it all depends on how flexible that tool needs to be, who's going to use that tool, and like what kind of content do you have right now, all those types of things. So you want to be asking the questions, not just in terms of what you need the day that you launch, but rather what you need to build to enable good content editing in the future. So I just want to walk through a couple examples to kind of get us thinking about this. And I like to kind of actually visualize some use cases. So that's what we'll do to start. And so this first example, I'm going to try showing a video. I hope this works. It's a very short little video. So it's just to show you kind of an example of scrolling down a very simple landing page. And I think of this as a simple page because there's not a lot of different types of content pieces mixed together. It's basically one content component after the next. So when I'm doing this kind of analysis, I try and avoid using the words block or paragraph or anything that has like a Drupal connotation. So I like the word like content component because it's pretty general. So if we just scroll down a page like this, and hopefully this isn't too choppy, we can see that there's basically just one element appearing after the next. So we have kind of 3 items that appear in a row at some point, but that is more like something that we could say is an embedded view that appears as one of our content components. So I'll just show again, the page is relatively simple. We just have one kind of call to action, a view, a call to action, and then another one. And I find this, just looking at it in terms of design-wise, maybe there's options around what each of those components looks like, but I don't see a lot of layout required to build a page like this. So in my analysis, I'm going to be thinking about kind of where everything comes from and what options are going to have to be available. And a page like this, I kind of think of it as being kind of two-dimensional. So the content editor, when they're creating the page, is going to be thinking about all the different components that make up the page. So those components are the gray boxes. And so for those of you who maybe can't see this, or you're not looking at your screen, there's just one gray box after the next. And then the yellow elements are the actual content itself. And those might seem to have a layout, like you might have three columns, but that's more of an internal logic to the content. So if I have three news items in a row, maybe it's because that's just how that view is configured. It's configured to be displayed as a grid. Or if I have an image on the left and text on the right, maybe it's a single call to action, and that's just how that call to action appears. That's just how that card is supposed to be displayed. So when I'm thinking about the types of landing pages I need to build, I would be kind of mapping out what types of options have to be available. And it's not really enough just to look at one page. So in that example, we just looked at, say, the home page of the website, and we're thinking about how we would build this. But ideally, when you're doing an analysis, you can think of, better to have a whole set of landing pages that you'd need to be able to build to know the type of complexity that would be required. Okay, so my next example is a university website. And this one is a little bit more complex. And what I see sometimes on this page, I see two elements next to each other, like an image and a list of links. And these are things that I think would have to be kind of interchangeable to build out these pages. And in this example, I have 2 pages, so it's a little bit more, gives you a little bit better of an idea. And so basically, this is just going to show a banner at the top, kind of a grid of news, some snippet of events. There is also some social media elements down at the bottom of the page. And we don't see a terrible amount of layout going on this page either, but the second page, if I look at it and I'm scrolling down, I do see more elements that are side by side. And so anytime when I see elements that are side by side, that are different types, that clearly are defined separately, I know that my content components are really living in a layout. And so for this type of design, I would see this more as being 3-dimensional. And I'm just making up these dimensions, right? So the dimensions are the gray boxes, which could kind of be like the sections of these pages. And they're just one after the other. The yellow boxes here are going to be the layout. So these provide the fact that does each section of my page have 1 column or 2 column or 3 columns. And then the purple boxes here are the actual content. And so those also could have their own logical structure, or they could just be, they could just be a piece of content that just sits there. But a piece of content could also, like in the previous example, be a set of news items in 3 columns. So these kind of determinations can seem a little bit arbitrary, but really what you want to think about is what is the content, what is the layout, and what are the bigger structural components of the page. And you want to kind of map that out when you're deciding what is required from the design that you have. So that's kind of from a requirements perspective, analyzing how complex your landing pages are. I think that that's a good exercise to do. Next, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the content editor's perspective. So this section of the presentation comes from some usability testing that I helped set up to compare how people use the layout builder and how they use paragraphs. And some of you might have seen the write-up that I did about this. And when I say usability testing that we did, my colleague Annika is a UX designer, and she actually conducted all the usability testing. She's very patient, and she watched people struggle to find the links that they needed to find to use these tools. And so we observed content editors using both tools. And we also tested Gutenberg. I saw Gutenberg that was mentioned in the comments, just to see what people thought of that alternative tool. So this usability testing, the purpose was to compare how content editors constructed a landing page, a very simple landing page, definitely in the first category. And we identified the use case of really more page building. We created a script, and then we ran through the exact same script with each version of the website. And we configured the websites in advance. So we configured one website where users were creating the content with paragraphs, and another website with the layout builder. And we configured them in advance to have these kind of building blocks, these content components that users could work with. Then we recruited the participants and we ran the tests. So we took videos and we made a lot of, made a huge spreadsheet with all of our findings, and there is a write-up that you can also see with more information. But I'll just share kind of a summary so you can see how this might influence your own decisions. So this is the landing page that we asked users to create, a relatively simple landing page. It does have these elements of content, though, that kind of live side by side. So, so actually, when I said before that this was definitely from the first use case, not necessarily the case. So there is actually a layout component to these landing pages, although it's a very simple page. The first impression. So I think it's always interesting with usability testing to ask users, what are your first impressions? What do you think of this page? And I think when we presented the layout builder as a way of creating this landing page, users were a little bit unsure first about where to go. And the reason that they were unsure was because content editors are looking for terminology that they're familiar with about creating content. And when users come to this page, they don't see any create content link like you would if you go to the content section of a Drupal website. And so it can just be confusing, the general terminology, block, section. These terms are not super evident. But that being said, once they were able to find the create custom block link there, which is how they would go about adding the content components to the page, everyone was able to figure out how to build the page, and everyone really loves the drag and drop type of interface. So that question of where do I create content, that came up again and again. And I think what we found kind of in follow-up work with some content editors is that applying some of the modules to improve the UX of the layout builder really helped with this. Very subtle changes to this interface made a big difference for content editors. So in terms of adding blocks, just the idea of adding blocks is a little bit confusing. And most of that confusion comes from the fact that by default, when you're using the layout builder, there are just many, many blocks available. So using the layout builder restrictions module to limit the options here and just basically remove everything except the create custom block link, that makes a huge difference to the usability and basically makes it possible for users to use this for page building. And then when editing custom blocks, there was also the challenge of just the terminology. So this word configure over here, configure is such a site building word, and it's really not something that content editors are used to seeing in Drupal because they don't usually have permission to configure things. So just if you are going to roll out this tool with content editors, then it's important to have that kind of training for them, documentation for them, so they know that that's the right thing to click on. And then comparing this to paragraphs. So paragraphs, if you look at the UI, it's much more similar to a standard content editing interface in Drupal. So when we're using paragraphs to manage a page like this, you know, it's a form in Drupal that like an edit form for editing content. And with paragraphs, the form becomes much longer, but it's still just like a node edit page that they're using. So we found that the content editors we tested with were definitely able to use paragraphs very well, and they found this actually a simpler approach up until the point of using paragraphs to add any kind of layout information. So some of you who have built sites with paragraphs might have taken this approach before of using paragraphs to actually manage a layout and having a paragraph type, perhaps called 2 columns. And so content editors found this very confusing and were unclear as to what that meant, and just the fact that the visual display of the layout wasn't being displayed to them in the form was a real hang up for them. So there were definitely some drawbacks to this approach, but the fact of the matter is that when you're using paragraphs to construct a page, there are a lot fewer clicks. And for anyone already familiar with the interface, it is going to seem more familiar and easier to use. So there were some kind of trade-offs there. And then when we pulled in Gutenberg, so we tested this because we thought it would be fun to just know how these two Drupal tools compared to the WordPress kind of experience. So we tested how content editors would create the exact same page using WordPress with Gutenberg editing turned on. And we found that at first users really liked the interface. So the first impression data was all really good. And they liked also how their landing page looked in the editing experience. But the preview of what the editors saw didn't really relate to the landing page that resulted on the front end. So there was definitely a disconnect there. And the most interesting thing that I found from the editing experience is the fact that although the tool looks really simple, because you have this in-place editing experience, that interface, that simplicity, really hides a lot of the complexity or hides a lot of the options that you might need to edit content components. And so it's fine if you're creating the most simple kind of content components, but as soon as you want to change any of those options, it becomes harder to use. So that kind of is an interesting finding. And another interesting thing was that the editors themselves actually pointed to the fact that they're willing to use a more complex tool if it means that they get more flexibility. And so they, as much as they might like the idea of a simple tool, they're willing to learn something new. So kind of an interesting finding and good takeaways for us if we're feeling like Layout Builder is just such a complex tool for content editors. Maybe it's worth it if that's what's required. So some takeaways from all of this usability testing before I draw any conclusions, just some general takeaways. So when you're building a tool for page building, you want to think about the content editor workflow. So it might not be exactly the same as what we think of as site builders. So when a content editor goes to create the page, they might not start thinking of it in Drupal terms first. They might think first in terms of what they want to communicate. They might draw out different content components and then figure out the flow of content that they want to appear on the page. And then they might fill in kind of more of these options about styling, what goes on the left and what goes on the right afterwards. And so that kind of content editing process, it's worthwhile thinking about it from the content editor perspective, and what might be best for them. And also to think about that when you're writing documentation. Editors really like a layout-oriented editing experience, but they don't necessarily want limitless options. So in my experience, if you give editors kind of a color wheel when you're asking them, like, what color do you want this heading to be? That's not a great experience, because they're going to be not sure what to do, like deer in the headlights, like what option do I pick? There's too many options. And they don't want to be saddled with the responsibility of making the website accessible, right? So you don't want to give them unlimited options. And that goes for things like the number of layouts they can pick from, or the number of content components that they have. The layout builder is complex because it's more flexible. So when we did the testing, a lot of the participants recognized that, and they verbalized it even. And the paragraphs is similar to a standard content editing experience. So even though it creates a more complex form, it's still a form that's familiar if you're working with content editors who already have Drupal experience. And then in terms of how we can take all this and decide how to customize the page building experience for content editors, there's some really specific things that we can do. So whether you decide to use one tool or another, you just don't want to include too many content component types, whether you're using blocks or paragraphs to do that. It's really useful to use things like entity or views reference fields to have content editors avoid duplicating content, and they will appreciate those types of tools. To limit the options that you give editors using the layout builder, there are some modules. The layout builder restrictions module is great. And you can also try the layout builder UX or layout builder modal modules. And there are plenty of other modules available that work with layout builder. So those are important to use. This site building kind of oriented terminology, I think that that's something that we can try and avoid. So when you're naming things in Drupal as you configure it, you can actually decide to name things that are more accessible, more appealing to content editors. So that's something just to think about when you're doing that kind of configuration and that kind of labeling. And just a final thing, so content editors love the media library. They love the idea of reusable media. And so don't forget that when you're creating these page building tools, because the more visual content you create, of course, the more media you need to fill in all. So here we get to the part of the presentation where I try and answer this question for you. So what kind of decision or what kind of criteria go into this decision of whether to use paragraphs or whether to use layout builder when designing this page building tool that your website probably needs? So I broke this up into pros and cons. So whichever one you choose, you should be aware of at least these pros and cons. So in both cases, paragraphs and layout builder, you can define these types. I find layout builder, when you're using it to build landing pages, the best way to use it is to define block types and then to make those available so that the content editors can use them to construct the page. Same thing with paragraphs. You're going to be defining these paragraph types that can be used to construct a page. So, and these options are really similar, and the way that they work is quite similar, just in terms of the content definition. With paragraphs, creating these actual content components in the UI does have fewer clicks if you kind of know ahead the types that you're building. So you can go and easily pick from the list, the drop-down list, which type you want to create and add that to the page. And it's similar to this normal content editing experience. On the other hand, with Layout Builder, even though it might be a little bit of a learning curve, the content editors do love the fact that they can drag and drop content from one place to another. And not just drag and drop it up and down the page, but in this additional dimension of the exact column that it appears in, that layout aspect that the layout builder gives us. And so even if the layouts that they're creating are simple, content editors love having access to those tools, and it makes them feel like they have more control over the page. And of course, that leads to more flexibility. So the layout builder is, of course, more flexible, and that could be a pro. It could also be nice to provide a less flexible experience because you want your pages to look more consistent. And then the last thing that I would say about the layout builder in terms of positive things, the layout builder, it allows you to use the same approach, all the same concepts for page building as you would for layout building. So I know I said I wasn't going to focus on layout building today, but if you're already using the layout builder to define what all of the recipes on your site look like, wouldn't it be nice if you just could use the same tool for page building? In terms of negatives, I think a lot of these things, well, some of these things can be addressed, but on the paragraph side, paragraphs is simply not designed to manage layouts. And so the content editor is expecting some kind of a preview of what their page is going to look like, and they're just not going to get that with the paragraphs module. It's hard to visualize the end product as a result. And then paragraphs itself, even though it's widely used, one of the most popular modules, is not part of Drupal core. So you're relying on this contrib module, which is always something to consider. On the other hand, layout builder is in core, which is great. The layout builder, some negatives about it. The editing UI is kind of desktop centric. So when we think about building a layout with 3 columns, of course, the 3 columns are going to appear on the desktop, but anyone viewing the same page on a mobile device is going to see this more collapsed layout. So it feels like you're getting this amazing preview, but that preview is only capturing one experience, whereas a lot of your users are probably using other types of devices. So I find that with paragraphs, the fact that you just have a big form, it doesn't show you what the page is going to look like, but it also doesn't lie to you about what the page is going to look like. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind with Layout Builder. And in terms of the experience, a lot of the things I mentioned about overwhelming number of options, that can be mitigated. But one thing that's hard to mitigate, I think, is this fact that you have a separate tab for editing the page and changing the layout. So that's something just to make sure that you capture if you're rolling out the Layout Builder and you have to train your editors. So for Layout Builder, there are lots of contrib modules, like I mentioned, to improve the UX. So you want to make sure that you take advantage of those. So I'll just mention some final important details. So whichever method you pick, there are some big caveats to using these types of page building tools in general. So first of all, accessibility and SEO are super important. And one of the strengths of Drupal is that you have structured content. And so building an accessible and SEO-friendly website easier, but when you throw structured content out the door, you don't want to mess that up. So really your content components themselves are structured, so that's good, your paragraph types and block types. So you want to make sure that the way those are displayed and the type of HTML they produce is going to be accessible. And you also want to make sure that your content is still searchable on your site and through Google. So that means making sure you have all the right metadata in place. And then finally, everybody's favorite topic, change management. So this decision about paragraphs versus Layout Builder, I think a lot of us would, go say, let's use Layout Builder. It's the new tool. It's got lots of pros. We really want to use this. Our content editors are going to love it. But the change management factor is real. So let's say, a large number of sites out there are already using paragraphs, and it's a big decision to make to switch to a different tool. There's not like this easy migration path that's available to you. And when we're talking about layout, what the layout, like where a block should be positioned, it's hard to capture that in a migration script, even if you're writing one from scratch. So this is a big challenge. Retraining your content editors is another challenge. And not just that, but actually the developers working on the project. So these are things to keep in mind. And it's documentation is going to be important, documenting all those content component types that you create. And so if you are switching from one solution to another, you're going to have to recreate that documentation. So just keep all that in mind before you decide to take the plunge and switch over to a new tool. So I put together a few resources here, including the usability testing results, a blog post version of this talk, and some great videos that, or a great video that's put together to show the layout builder in action, as well as some links to modules. And there's some great documentation that I found that Georgia Tech put together for their layout builder implementation. And I think this is just a great example of the type of documentation you might need to build. So check that out as a really valuable resource. And my team does Drupal training. So if you're interested in using these tools or just learning Drupal from the ground up, if you're onboarding your team, I just wanted to give a shout out to these trainings. We were meant to do some training at DrupalCon and that got canceled because of the online format, but we do have lots of online trainings coming up that you can check out. So I'm gonna hop over to the chat to see what kind of questions have been popping up. So now is a great time, if you have questions, to go and add them to the chat. All right, so I'm going to try and find the questions amid all the discussion about everything in the chat. Yeah, the presentation will be available on online, I think through the session page. If you have custom blocks with Layout Builder, wouldn't you run into an issue with content editors creating an unsustainably large custom block library? So that's a great question. The blocks that you create when you create these inline blocks with Layout Builder, it's not the same as a block that you'd create through the block layout page. So it's not going to be the same category. So that concern has been mitigated to some degree. But as with anything, a large amount of content is something to manage for sure. Another question, when building a page with Layout Builder, what is the best approach to move this to stage and production environment? Like, is this a manual thing? So actually the nice thing about Layout Builder is that when you're creating these layouts, that is a content change. So it's going to be a change that's made in the database. And here I'm talking about page building. And I see that as an advantage because it means if a content editor goes and builds one of these pages, they don't have to deploy it like you would configuration. Whereas the layout building tools that Layout Builder gives you are configuration. So that's a difference there. As far as I understand it, I'm not sure. There might be a way to deploy pages built with the Layout Builder, but I'm not sure. A question, are both options compatible with workflows and accessibility requirements? So in terms of workflows, you are going to have perhaps more of a challenge. Like you can certainly draft a page using Layout Builder, but when we imagine standard workflows in Drupal where you might want to see the differences between two versions of a page, obviously that's going to be more of a challenge with Layout Builder, just because you have that layout change as well. And in terms of accessibility requirements, it's really up to the theme of the site to manage that. So that's definitely a challenge when I always just think of this example of like if you make the entire page managed with the layout builder or with paragraphs, it's the same problem. And you just say, okay, every single thing on the page is layout builder or paragraphs. Then what if the first thing on the page has to be an H1, right? You want your title of your page to be an H1. Maybe you assume, oh, of course, the content editor is going to add a banner first. That's my H1, that's at the top of the page. But with the drag and drop tools, they can easily take that and drag it to the bottom of the page. So you want to avoid that. You want to make sure that whatever is that H1 at the top of the page, you want to make sure that that's always there and that's not a flexible thing that can change. So then, you know, likewise, you'd want to make sure that the content components you do build have semantic markup. That's the #1 thing for accessibility. And that, for example, they do have a title that, you know, you start with an H2 to kind of inherit or go down to the next level after the H1. So yeah, you have to think about accessibility basically at every step, and I would recommend starting that in the design process, not waiting until you're building the content components. Okay, I'm going to keep scrolling up. Any suggestions for making sure that brand standards are kept by content editors? Okay, that's a great question. That first example I showed you of the site, the little video scrolling down, the first iteration of that design just had a set of, here are all our brand colors, and I think there were 10 colors. And so I came in as the site builder themer on the project, and I said, no, we're not going to do it that way. Let's make sure that this site is accessible. So let's create a set of color palettes. So it's definitely easier for the content editors, but also just easier, I think, as a developer to figure out or to wrap your head around if there are a more limited set of options. So we said, okay, a call to action can be one of, you know, 5 color palettes, and those reflect the brand standards, and then it can have a few other adjustments about the image position. And those were the options that we built into those content components. And so each content component, you have to kind of think about the brand standards. So these days, that's often managed by having some kind of a pattern library, a set of patterns that you use that would probably be closely related to the content components that you give to content editors. And you'd be doing your brand standards review at that point. All right, let me just see if there's time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Some of you have great comments, and then you put a question mark at the end, but I think it's a comment. Are both options compatible? Oh, that one was asked again. Great duplicate question. So I'll just maybe answer one more. That one thing that came up earlier, I think it was in the Dries Q&A, was a question of all these tools like Layout Builder, paragraphs, and then what about a tool like Cohesion, which is something that Acquia started to offer as kind of another solution for page building. And that's a tool that kind of goes beyond these 2 options. It provides the level of, like, you can choose what components go on the page. It has the layout aspect, but then it also allows you to build kind of a library of styles through the editor, through the configuration experience. So you don't have to go into a Drupal theme to add more options for what these components look like. So that kind of adds one additional level of complexity. And I know as themers, sometimes we feel like, oh, I would like to be able to edit everything in the theme. But if you've heard of this Cohesion tool, its goal is to give all those kind of more visual options also through the editing experience. So that's just to kind of add that. So thanks everyone for attending today. I hope this helped you kind of make this decision and helped you think about landing pages and layouts in Drupal in a new way. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me on the general event chat. I'm checking my chat all the time. So you can just ping me there. And my name's Suzanne Dergacheva, so you can find me. And it was really nice to see you all here. Enjoy the rest of your DrupalCon.